The income section of MA has its statutory foundation in ORC 310518 C1A through N, and primarily A through D. A provides that the income from all sources must be considered. B requires that the relative earning abilities of the parties be considered. C relates to the considering the age and health of the parties. And D refers to the retirement benefits of the party. So directly or indirectly, each of the first four factors relates to the party's income. And, in fact, most of the other factors relate in one way or another to income as well. I referred earlier to ORC 3105.171. It has its application here because Factor A includes income derived from property that was already divided, dispersed, or distributed as separate or non-marital property under ORC 3105.171. I think that that's interesting because the argument is often raised on appeal that income derived or related to separate property should not be considered. You can appreciate how easy it is to make that argument. After all, the property has already been exclusively awarded to a party, free and clear of the claims on the other spouse, so it would seem improper to consider that income when it comes to spousal support. However, Factor A is crystal clear on this point, and I only know of one case where inclusion of such income was actually avoided. I think it was the Simcannon case, and we'll cover that a bit later. In MA's main window, the income section is broken down into three categories, which are wages, other taxable income, and non-taxable income. You could say there's really only two categories of income, taxable and non-taxable, and you'd be right. However, MA separates the income data entry into three parts in order to make it a little easier for you. It does this by separating taxable income into wage income that you can copy from a W-2 and other taxable income which you can copy from a tax return. Even still, the divisions are designed to streamline the data entry process, not to rigidly adhere to any generally accepted accounting practices. For that reason, the other taxable income worksheet is designed like an income tax return and has a few fields that are considered non-taxable, such as tax-exempt interest. As I said, however, the goal is easy data entry, not compliance with accounting standards. So we've mixed these fields in. From the main window, if you click on the plus sign to the left of item 2, income, you'll expand that section and you'll see wages as the first sub-item. Further, if you click on the plus sign to the left of wages, you'll see there are separate worksheets, one for the husband and one for the wife. Now I'll tell you something you already know. Thinking can be hard. Clients may not know how to do it, and courts sometimes don't want to do it. So it's left up to you as the attorney to do most of the thinking in the presentation of your client's case. That's natural. MA gives you a leg up by setting up the wages worksheet like a W-2 or a pay stub. With that information in hand, you should be able to tab through the fields, copying the information from the corresponding area on the W-2. No thinking necessary. In fact, this type of data entry doesn't require any special expertise. Anyone in the law office should be capable of doing the entry work. That way you can save your thinking skills for more important things. One thing that has confused some users are the blank lines or underscores on this worksheet. You can see that there's one under bonuses and commissions. Users have a tendency to put the bonus or commission entry on the line underneath when the amount should actually be placed to the right of the bonus commission label. The same thing applies with overtime. The overtime amount should be entered to the right of the overtime label and not underneath it. The blank lines are for descriptions that you sometimes find on W-2s. MA expects those to be text entries and does not use them in a calculatory sense. That's the very reason why we sometimes get calls saying MA is not calculating overtime correctly. The husband in our example doesn't have any of these oddball payroll items, but I'll enter some overtime anyway just to show you what I mean. Then I'll remove it before proceeding to the wife's wages worksheet. As you probably noticed by now, the husband in our example doesn't have any wage income. He has other types of income, and we'll cover those in just a moment. As with the general information worksheet, again, I don't think it's important that you watch me fill the wife's wage worksheet out. Just start at the top and tap your way through the fields. The wage worksheet has room for 6 employers, but most of the time you'll probably be using only one. In our example, the wife divided her time between 2 employers. I took her 2 W-2s and copied them to the wage worksheet's employers 1 and 2 fields. The other thing I'd like to call your attention to, and there isn't much more on this annual payroll form to call your attention to, are the Social Security and Medicare fields. Make sure you complete these 2 fields accurately for the reason that there are going to be significant adjustments to income that will have an impact when it comes to calculating the tax consequences of spousal support payments and when you're trying to equalize income. In cases of lower incomes, the combined Social Security and Medicare may total more than federal and state withholding, so you want to be careful about these items. You could be doing a disservice to your client if you overlook them. Or depending on whether you're representing the obligor or the obligee, maybe you'd be doing your client a service by overlooking them. At any rate, another thing I want to call your attention to is the YTD button up here. YTD stands for year to date. In most instances, it's best if you have a W-2 reflecting annual payroll. However, if you have only a pay stub handy, it will likely have the same type of information that you see on a W-2. Therefore, you can take the year-to-date information, things like bonuses, base wages, local withholding, things like that, and enter those figures on the wage worksheet. Then click on the YTD button. Doing so brings up the dialog you see on your screen now. In this dialog, you can enter in the year-to-date date, as well as selecting the appropriate pay period. Then, when you click on the OK button, which I will not do here because it'll annualize the figures that I've entered already, which are already annualized, the year-to-date amounts that you previously entered will be converted to annualized amounts. A caution is appropriate here. The YTD function works on all 6 items in the wages worksheet, so you can't just enter one employer's annual amounts and a different employer's as a year-to-date amounts, because when you click on the YTD, both employers' amounts will be acted on. The same is true if you click through the YTD function twice. Not so much clicking on the button twice, but going through the dialog twice. It's going to annualize the amounts twice, and that's certainly not what you want. So be aware that if you accidentally go to the YTD dialog, you can use the cancel button to get back to the wages worksheet without modifying your data. MA is only going to annualize if you click the OK button in the YTD dialog. Lastly, be aware that the later in the year that you annualize, the more accurate your estimate of annual income will be. Performing annualization in January, for example, may not result in accurate annualized amounts. Sure, if the party is salaried or works a steady 40-hour week at the same pay, annualizing will be reasonably accurate when performed early in the year. But this probably wouldn't apply to parties whose income varies from week to week, like a salesperson or an hourly employee who doesn't work the same number of hours every week. The next income subsection is Other Taxable Income. So I'm going to click on the Close Active Window button here to get rid of the wife's wage worksheet and return to the main window. If the income section has a plus sign to the left of it, you'll need to click on the plus sign to expand that section. When you do, you can see that the next section after wages is Other Taxable Income, and it also has a plus sign to the left of it. Clicking there discloses the links for the husband and the wife's separate worksheets. I'll continue by clicking on the husband's item, and up pops the Other Taxable Income worksheet for the husband. Like the wages worksheet, this worksheet is also set up so that you or even a staff person without special training should be able to perform the necessary data entry without getting bogged down in accounting or bookkeeping practices. Essentially, if you have the party's last year's Form 1040, you can copy the information right from the income tax return to this worksheet because the worksheet is designed to look like Form 1040. This is the first worksheet where you can see a little bit of MA beginning to do its work. That's evidenced by looking at the top of the return where you see that some of the fields have already been completed. The taxpayer identification fields. For example, name and address are completed. And dependent children, at least those whose dependency checkbox was checked, they're listed here in the dependency section. Also note that the wage information that you entered on the wage worksheet should be transferred to line 7. Now, in this regard, you'll recall that the husband had none, and that's why you don't see anything on his line 7. But the wife did, and if we take a peek at her other taxable income worksheet, we'd see that line 7 is completed with the total of her 2 employers. The only thing you need to be concerned about at the top of the worksheet is the filing status. In most instances, you'll choose single if the party will be living separate and apart, or head of household if the party will be living with children or other dependents. Of course, if a party is remarried, as you might encounter in the case of a post-decree motion to modify spousal support, you may need to select married filing jointly or separately, as the case may be. After you've made this filing status selection, it's just a matter of copying a party's Form 1040 information to the worksheet, assuming, of course, that you have access to a Form 1040. Line 8A goes on line 8A and so on. The worksheet line numbers parallel an actual Form 1040, so data entry on this worksheet should go pretty smoothly. Recall that the purpose of MA's design is to streamline data entry, so don't get too locked in on the main window labels. As I mentioned previously, and as you see here on line 8B, there's provision for entering tax-exempt income, which obviously doesn't come within the scope of taxable income. The thinking here is that you've already got the party's Form 1040 in your hand. You may as well enter any non-taxable income that's there, since the form contains that information anyway. What I want to do at this point is to call your attention to parts of the other taxable income worksheet that differ from the real Form 1040. That happens in the dependency section here, which is broken down into 2 sections. Now, it's broken down into 2 sections so that MA can complete child exemptions based on your general information worksheet entries. However, some parties are supporting elderly parents or children from prior marriages, and in those instances, you need to manually enter those dependents on the bottom part of that section of the worksheet here. As far as the exemption section goes, because MA completes the top part automatically, you can't even tab to the first 10 lines. The next difference that I'll mention is line 11, alimony. Because MA needs to keep alimony separate from alimony payable with respect to prior marriages, in the unlikely event that such would be the case, I don't think I ever had a case like that, there are 2 line 11s on the worksheet. The first is for alimony received from prior marriages. That's the one you must complete. And the second is completed by MA. That's alimony in the case at hand. Insofar as the other taxable income worksheet is concerned, that's about it. So I'm going to click on the Close Active Window button to return to the main window. I don't think there's anything of particular interest in the wife's worksheet, except, like I mentioned earlier, that line 7 entry is completed from the information that we had previously seen on the wage worksheet. If you'd like to see how that was completed, you can download the MAB file that I've referred to a few times already and load it into your MA 2010 program. Alternatively, you can download the PDF printout of the sample file that we've been working on. That download has copies of each and every worksheet and report in MA. Now that brings us to the non-taxable income section, which, like the previous 2 income subsections, has sub-items for the husband and the wife. I'll display the husband's worksheet right now. Again, notice that the non-taxable income that was entered on the other taxable income worksheet has been already transferred to this worksheet. In this case, it's qualified dividends, which were non-taxable. The information that transfers automatically is listed here at the top. Skipping child support for the moment, the next 5 items, tax-exempt interest, qualified dividends, and non-taxable parts of IRA distributions, pensions, and Social Security, are all items that transfer automatically. And it says so right there in the parentheticals. As a result, all you really need to do is to consider these other items of non-taxable income. As you can guess, the types of other income are infinitely varied, and therefore there are a number of lines at the bottom that you can use for entering your own descriptions and amounts. We have one here because the husband is an amateur musician and earns $4,500 a year. Women who do hairstyling apart from their regular employment would be another good example of miscellaneous non-taxable income. There's nothing more about this form that warrants mentioning, except that it's got a nice section at the bottom right here where information from the 3 income worksheets is summarized. That is, total wages, total taxable income, less wages of course, and total taxable income. One final observation about the income section involves asking, what's it worth? For example, what difference does it make to include the husband's $4,500 of band income? And you can think of it like this. If your starting point is going to be income equalization, the difference it makes between the parties' incomes is 1 for every $2. Thus, a $4,500 addition to the husband's income results in a $2,250 difference in annual income between the husband and the wife, which breaks down into a nearly $200 per month payment of spousal support. It's not an insignificant amount. Like my dad used to say, if you saw it laying on the sidewalk, you'd bend over and pick it up. Furthermore, the lower the incomes that you're working with, of course, the more important the impact of omitting something like that would be. So you want to be careful about that. The obvious bottom line to all this is that you want to be especially careful in all of the income subsections when you're making your entries. You don't want to omit any income, and the best starting point for marshaling a party's income information is a copy of their income tax return. And in cases where a party's tax return discloses business income, whether it's Schedule C or E, you'll want to be looking very carefully at the supporting documentation. Often it will be necessary to resort to an expert for a thorough investigation. Even with a tax return, you still got to keep your eyes open. A bartender or a waitress's tips, for example, will not typically appear on tax returns, at least not in their entirety. And some forms of income, like side job carpentry work or band income, you may need to do a little digging to make sure you're getting everything. Before moving on to the next section, I'd like to talk about the case law that relates to what we've covered so far on the subject of income. Computers allow us to do some pretty dazzling legal research that wasn't possible 20 years ago. Because spousal support is governed in Ohio by statute, you can perform some pretty worthy research by simply searching the statutory section, 3105.18. For purposes of zeroing in on specific factors listed in Part C of that section, you can, for example, search 3105.18 C1A. And that's exactly what I did for preparing this section of the video, and it resulted in an informative survey of case law that was reasonably on point. Is this a perfect system for researching spousal support? Nah, not really. There are cases involving spousal support that did not specifically refer to a 3105.18 factor by letter, and there are spousal support cases that may contain relevant points that were decided before 3105.18 was enacted. In spite of those shortcomings, however, I found my search results to be pretty much what I was looking for. A search of 3105.18 C1A, for example, turned up over 200 cases. Of those 200 cases, about 100 used the search term in the context that I was expecting, and there's a list of those 100 cases in the downloadable materials. As I mentioned earlier, of the listed 14 factors, the first 4 deal either directly or indirectly with income, and as one of the cases will point out, most of the other factors deal in one way or another with income as well. For your further information, a search of factor B yielded 34 more cases, C 19 cases, and D 14 cases. Now naturally, it would take too much time and I'd have to shoot a gun off or make some other loud noise to wake you up at the end, so I'm not going to cover each of these cases. Also, if you look at the downloadable materials, you'll see that in some instances the same case may appear in more than one factors list, but I'm still only going to cover a few of the more interesting ones. CaseMaker, by the way, produced cases related to 3105.18 all the way back to 1953. Regardless, the list of cases I'm presenting is an excellent starting point for legal research on the issue of spousal support, and this is especially true if you don't have access to electronic resources such as CaseMaker or whoever else provides such services. Finally, I'm not presenting these cases in any particular order except chronologically grouped by 3105.18c1 factor. Nor am I claiming that these are the leading cases with respect to a particular subject. What I am claiming is that this is a valuable list of recent cases having 3105.18c1 factors as their subjects. With that disclaimer, here we go. We'll start with Collins versus Collins, and because the full cites are listed in the downloadable